I'm getting ready to do the finishing on my very first Grimm's Fairytale storybook, The Frog Prince. And I am so happy with the way the stitching turned out on this. This is exactly what I had envisioned in my head when I started designing this. So really, I could not be happier with the stitching. Now, when I started working on this, I wasn't exactly sure how I would be finishing it. So I stitched my pieces on two separate pieces of fabric. But I honestly don't mind having that seam in the middle. It kind of makes it look even more like a book. So that is the first thing that I did, was I took my two pieces and I backstitched along where I wanted the seam, and then I pressed that seam open. So as far as the finishing for this one goes, again, I'm not 100% sure of how I'm going to do this. I know what I want the finished product to look like, but I really am not 100% sure on how I'm going to get there. I do know that this fabric is extremely thin. You can see right through it. So I know that I'm going to need to back that with some white fabric. So this is just basic white linen, not even cross-stitch linen. It's just linen off the bolt that you could find at a fabric store. And I cut this to the exact size of the stitching so that that will back it and it won't be nearly as see-through. I also cut a piece of fabric that I want to be the back of my storybook. I cut that the exact same size as well. Now I know that to do the construction for this, it's going to require me to do sort of a pillowcase type of construction where I sew it with the insides out with the right size facing each other, and then you sew around, leaving a hole, and then turn it all inside out. I'm not 100% sure of exactly how it's all going to work though, because I want to add in this piping. So I think that this would make a really cute edge on the storybook so that it's not just the fabric. I think it would be really cute if this was the edge of the storybook. The problem that I have run into is, and this isn't really even a problem if I am honest, because lately I have been enjoying sewing by hand, not just cross-stitching by hand, but sewing by hand. And so normally I probably would do this project on a sewing machine because I just really want the construction to be sturdy and well done. However, I have misplaced the zipper foot for my sewing machine. So if I want to put this piping in, I'm going to have to sew this by hand in order to get close enough to make this piping look right. So I'm going to be sewing this project entirely by hand. That's going to make it a little trickier, I feel like, to get it all just right. But it should be okay as long as I can get close to this edging and make it all the way around without any major mishaps. I'm also not 100% sure of where I'm going to leave my turnout gap, because I also am going to be inserting cardboard in here. I want the storybook to be relatively hard, like a book. Like I want it to be sturdy and stiff. So I'm going to be inserting cardboard, but I don't want it to be just completely hard. So I'm contemplating adding some batting, quilt batting, into the project as well to give it a little bit more of like a soft cushiness to the hardness. So there's a lot of things that I don't have 100% figured out how I want to do it yet, but we are going to go for it and hopefully it all turns out in the end. So if you guys want to follow along with me on this journey, hopefully we will have a successful finish for the Frog Prince. I began by placing my different layers of fabric in the proper order and pinning them together, making sure not to put any of the pins through the actual cross-stitching because that can cause some unrepairable damage to your work. Next, I started working with the cording, placing it into the seam and sewing it the way that I had originally intended. However, after sewing a portion of it in and turning the work out to examine it, I realized that I was not getting the look that I wanted. Because of this, I decided to sew the fabric pieces together without the cording, and I would attach the cording outside the seam afterwards. As I sewed around the project, I inserted a ribbon at the halfway point of the shorter side of the book to be used as a closure, and I sewed it into the seam. In order to do it in this new way, it meant that I had to remove the seam insert from my cording. This was a very tedious process, and I highly recommend that you purchase plain cording without the seam insert for this project. If you have cording with the seam insert and need to remove it, be careful not to cut the thread that is sewn through the actual cording, because that is what holds the cording together, and I learned the hard way that by cutting it, your cording will unravel completely. Once I got my cording how I wanted it, I cut it in half because the more I thought about it, the more I didn't want the cording to run across where the book would fold in half. I thought it would make it difficult for the book to fold if the cording ran across. So I decided to cut the cording in half, and I would run it around both sides with a split at the seam on both the top and the bottom. So I've cut my cording in half, and I have sewn from just to the side of the seam in the center. So we've got the book seam in the center. I started just to the side of that, and I stitched down and up. I inserted my ribbon, and I'm going to go back and reinforce that ribbon a little bit because I only caught it with a few stitches and it feels a little wobbly, so I'm going to go back and run a few more stitches over that. But I inserted that at the halfway point, and then I came up and I came across, and now I am at that halfway point again. So here's my seam at the center, and before I go across here, I want to take my cording and I want to sew that into the seam, directly into the seam. So I'm going to bring my cording up, and I don't need much of it to hang out. I'm going to put a little bit just because in case this unravels more, I want to be able to trim it off. But now I have it right at that seam, that halfway seam, and I'll just sew that in along with the other one for the other side. And I'll just sew directly across these two to lock them in place. That way, when I get down to where I'm turning it the right side out, this part of the cording will already be attached. And then what I'm going to do, instead of sewing it into the seam the way I tried at the beginning, I'm going to hand sew kind of like a whip stitch, if you will. I'm going to sew the cording onto the edge of the book all the way around. But I want the ends to be tucked in because I don't want them to be fraying on the outside. I want the ends to be tucked into the book. So that's why I am going to go ahead and I'm going to insert them right now, so across them. And then when I get to the end and it's sewn all the way around, I'm still going to have to leave a little gap here to where I can tuck these ends back in and then sew over them as well. This is getting kind of complicated, you guys. I don't blame you if you don't follow everything that I'm saying right now, but I think if you see as I go along how it progresses, I think it'll make more sense. All you need to know right now is that I started to the side of that middle seam. I sewed all the way around, included my ribbon. I'm going to sew, and before sewing over that middle seam again, I inserted both of my cording pieces, one that will go along this side, one that will go along that side, and I'm going to sew those into place in that seam. So for now, that's all you need to worry about, and we'll figure out the rest of it as we go along. Okay, so I've sewn across my cording to the corner and down. I inserted my second ribbon, and I'm now at this corner here. So I still have this space unstitched to turn it right side out. I did go back and put a few more stitches in my ribbons just to make sure that they were properly secure. But I'm ready to turn it right side out, so let's go ahead and see what I have. I have not seen this yet, so let's see what it all looks like. I was careful here not to be too rough on the cross stitch because I didn't want to damage any of the stitches. If your project looks wrinkly after turning it inside out, you will want to press it with an iron before continuing. But I did not find it necessary for mine. Okay, so there we go. I still need to work with the corners a little bit to get those popped out, but so far it's looking great. And now you can see more of what I intend to do with cording. So once I get this all done, I get the cardboard inserted and get this all sewn up, I'm then going to take the cording and I'm going to sew it along the edge like that. So my next step is going to be to get the cardboard inside, decide what I want to do with adding any sort of batting or not, but so far it's looking good. I'm so excited to see it making some progress, and let's just keep going. I cut 2 pieces of cardboard, each slightly smaller than 1/2 of the book, and tested them inside the book to make sure that they were the proper size before continuing. Then, to add the padded look that I wanted, I glued quilt batting to one side of each piece. I spread the glue with a paintbrush because I didn't want any of the glue spots to harden into clumps that could be felt through the fabric. Once I had the glue spread, I placed my quilt batting, cut to the same size as the cardboard, on top and pressed it into the glue. Then I let it sit for a few hours to dry before moving forward. After the glue was dry, I inserted the first piece of cardboard into the book and slid it over into the enclosed side. Then I inserted the second piece into the open side. Next, it was time to sew the book closed by ladder stitching the final seam, making sure to keep the same 1/4 inch seam allowance that I had used before. I left a small hole at the center so that the ends of the cording could be inserted and hidden in the book. I then whip stitched the cording all the way around the book, inserted the ends into the hole, and sewed it shut. This process gave me a much more polished look than my original attempt to sew the cording into the seam, and I'm very happy with how it came out. My final step was to sew along the center seam through all the layers of the book to keep the pieces of cardboard inside from sliding about and to give it a firmer point on which to fold. And the storybook is now complete. I could not be more thrilled with the way this turned out. You know, it's really rare to have a project turn out exactly how you had it envisioned in your head, but this one was one of those rare occasions where it really did turn out exactly how I wanted it, and I could not be more happy. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching me put this project together, and I hope that if you decide to do this project as well, that you have just as much fun as I did. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.